Good morning, technically morning in Raleigh, North Carolina. It is June 20th as I am recording this. That's a Father's Day, but that's not why I'm talking to you right now. I am talking to you right now because I want to talk to you about Juneteenth, which is just passed. I'd have to make another recording about this, but I thought I could probably make some improvements here. So I figured I'd take another shot at it. So, one, just to be clear about my qualifications. One, I guess anybody can talk about this stuff, but I do teach history. I believe I brought that up. I teach African American history at an HBCU. Um, I I lived in Texas for 7 years and attended Texas Tech. Um, and one of my fields was African American history. So, okay, so with that in mind, let's talk about it. So, and I also went to the University of New Mexico, which also celebrated Juneteenth. But let's talk about it. So as I'm talking about it, I should also keep in mind, or let you know that I'm not an authoritative source on this, but I do have, background in the area. So, as I'm talking about it, here's what we need to keep firmly in mind. Juneteenth, named so because of June 19th, 1865, was made possible because of General Granger, who had proclaimed in Galveston that slavery was over, and that indeed the slaves in Texas are free. Now, this is because of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Now, why is it taking this long? One, keep in mind that just because Abraham Lincoln says that all the slaves in the rebelling states are, their slaves are forever free. Remember, they're involved in war, right? The Confederacy is resisting. Clearly they're not going to free these slaves. Well, by 1865, June 19th, they're no longer resisting. So that's what allows this to go forward. Now, here's something else to keep in mind. That this is closure, isn't it? It's closure. It really is. It brings about closure, if you will, to the Emancipation Proclamation, set out, I suppose, January 1st, 1863. This Juneteenth General Order, which would have been known as General Order 3, by General Granger, leads to important closure for the Union, I suppose, as a whole. The final group of slaves that would have been subjected to this are now finally free. That's important. Now, here's another thing to keep in mind, that the Emancipation Proclamation is what? It is an executive order. And executive orders are only as good as the president that signs them. A president that follows can easily overturn it. Well, Andrew Johnson, who was a slaveholder at one time, small slaveholder, born in Raleigh, by the way, but finds himself in Tennessee. He decides that slavery is an issue as well, right? has been a problem, and he particularly blames the planter class, correct? The wealthy planter elite. And so he doesn't, rescind, if you will, the Emancipation Proclamation, and, basically allows it to go forward. By this time, Juneteenth would have been under President Andrew Johnson. So that's certainly something to keep in mind. Now, ultimately, it's going to be the 13th Amendment that will free the slaves, won't it? And so here's something else we have to keep in mind with that. The 13th Amendment is in December. And keep in mind that the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't cover the so-called border states like Kentucky, which is a southern state, or, Delaware, Missouri, West Virginia, Washington, D.C., although Washington, D.C. is already taken care of. Missouri, did I say Missouri already? I can't even remember. But anyway, it doesn't address those states. And Kentucky and Delaware pretty much allow slavery to continue until that 13th Amendment. Matter of fact, Kentucky doesn't officially ratify the 13th Amendment until, I believe, 1976. They did a little better than Mississippi. So, but at any rate, it doesn't matter. Once that amendment is passed, Kentucky has to stand aside, and they did. Now, but Kentucky and Delaware keep slaves until December. So, so that's an issue that we have to look at. Now, with that being said, here's another complication. And the other complication is the fact that the states, the 13th Amendment would cover the states, but the 13th Amendment doesn't cover dependent nations. What do you mean by dependent nation? Well, what's an example of a dependent nation? Well, we're talking about Native American tribes who did enslave African Americans. So here's another Juneteenth to think about. June 14th, if you will, 1866. Remember the Choctaw and Chickasaw continued to have slaves in 1866. So, June 14th would be the last day that I know of African Americans being owned by Native Americans. Which is also interesting because after this happens, there's also, I believe in both of these reservations, both of these nations, you're going to see what? You are actually going to see Jim Crow-like provisions, Jim Crow-like treatment on these reservations toward blacks. Now, I should also keep in mind, I should also say to you a couple of things. One, Delaware had very few slaves, by December of 1865. Kentucky, most of their slaves had either been freed or escaped. And, by comparison to a state like Virginia, or probably even Kentucky, these Native American tribes don't have that many slaves. But with that being said, it is certainly something you have to factor into the equation. Correct? So there you go there. June 14th, 1866. The Cherokee had already freed their slaves in 1863. But let's stay upon Native American. Hold on a second. One other thing. You might wonder, how are these slaves freed? How does the United States get, if you will, the Choctaw and Chickasaw to free their slaves through treaties. They're going to be free through treaties. So that's something to keep in mind. The United States will work out treaties upon which Native Americans will free their slaves. Now, I also want to press upon you, it's not just the so-called 5 civilized tribes. Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Cherokee are 3 of the 5 civilized tribes. Of course, you have the Creeks, and then, if you will, the Seminole, which have a real complicated history, don't they? You have a lot of so-called black Seminole in the Seminole Nation. But at any rate, what else do we have to look at? We got to stick with Native Americans still, because not only do Native Americans own blacks, but Native Americans, sometimes through war, found themselves possibly capturing and enslaving some whites. And there were Native Americans that owned members of Native American tribes themselves. And this seemed to be an issue out west. And because of the frontier-like conditions, it took a while for the U.S. to get, if you will, to these Native Americans. Now, such Native American group would be, if you will, the Klamath. Now, the Klamath are in California, well, mostly Southern Oregon, Northern California. That's where the Klamath are. And the Klamath, if you will, it owned quite a few, if you will, other, kept slaves from other tribes. And so I think one of them was called the Haish, something like that. And they had owned these slaves. The United States worked out several treaties, if you will, with the Klamath. In several instances, they tried to include the abolition of slavery in the treaties, but the Klamath wouldn't have it. Until eventually, there was, if you will, an Indian chief, a Klamath chief who was basically, kicked out, deposed. And in 1869, those slaves were freed. Now, to be completely honest with you, I don't know if I have a definitive answer for, when the last chattel slave, if you will be, freed. Now, obviously, this also brings people to what about, if you will, the convict leasing, sharecropping, I suppose, chain gangs, things of the like. Yeah, they do happen, and they definitely they're definitely versions of forced labor. And in some cases, some of the treatment, especially if you're talking about convict leasing, the treatment would be almost as harsh, just as harsh. You could probably even make an argument that it may even be more intense if you were in slavery. But it's also true that these are not versions of chattel slavery. They're definitely forced labor. And they certainly need to be talked about and reckoned with. But they're not chattel slavery. It's just not the same thing. Horrible, indeed. But, not quite the same thing. I'm trying to think about what else I want to talk about here. One thing I do want to say is, a lot of this is nuance. And with this nuance, it's easy to take this nuance for someone to, basically convert nuance into negativity. Now, should we still celebrate or observe Juneteenth? Absolutely. Because once again, it does bring closure. It does bring the Emancipation Proclamation full circle. And I think that's important, if you will, to keep in mind. Just because I'm going through this doesn't mean that I'm trying to diminish, if you will, Juneteenth. I'm just trying to give you more of a perspective on it. And obviously, you should also look at other perspectives. as well, and I'm certainly not the defining authority on Juneteenth. So anyway, take care everyone, and goodbye.